Okay, so onto my second sheet. I have my same materials, water, paper towels, and then my watercolor palette. And then for this one, I'm going to need a variety of other materials, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So the first one is called glazing. So this is layering paint over dry paint, and then it allows the underlying colors to shine through. So this is going to require a little bit of time on this one. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab a little bit of my watercolor, and then I'm just going to put a little layer down, and then I'm going to let that dry and come back to it later. So I'm going to just put one little light layer down. And then after that dries, I'm going to come back to it. So then I'm going to rinse my brush and get ready for the next one. So the next one is called a resist. So what we're going to do is we're going to use crayons. And what you do is you make little lines or shapes or anything with the crayons. You can color some spaces in. And wherever you color with the crayons, because it's wax, the water is not going to go over top of it, so it's going to leave little white lines wherever you put the crayon down. So then when you start with your pigment over top, it's going to kind of move around where the crayon is. So you can see my little crayon lines are starting to come through, and you can see that it leaves those little marks where the crayon was. So wherever I put the crayon, it's leaving the paper white. That's what those little marks and lines are. Okay? The next one is salt. So when you put salt onto watercolor, the salt's going to soak up the water, and it's going to leave like kind of a little icicle type of pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with wet pigment. This only works while the watercolor's wet. So if you try to do it while it's dry, it's not going to work. So I'm going to put my color down first. I'm going to be fancy, and I'm going to blend some of my colors together so it looks prettier. So I'm going to get these colors down together, blend them, and then while it's wet, so while my watercolor is still wet, it has not dried, I'm going to take some salt and I'm going to sprinkle it over top. I'm going to do a very light little pinch, okay? If you do too much, it's not going to work very well. So I'm just going to do a very little light pinch over top of the wet watercolor. And the thing about this is it's not really going to work, or you're not going to see the results until it's dry. So it's not going to look exactly what it's going to look like immediately, but as it dries, that salt's going to soak it up, and it's going to leave that little pattern. And then after it dries, we can brush the salt off, and it'll leave that nice little salt pattern. So we just have to leave that one to dry. All right, the next one is alcohol. So you can use rubbing alcohol. So I'm going to take my brush, and I'm going to put some pigment on my page first. Okay. Get some pigment down on my page. And I want to use a nice amount of pigment so it shows up, looks nice. Maybe I'll blend some colors in there together so it looks even prettier. All right, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a Q-tip and then a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and I'm going to put the rubbing alcohol on the Q-tip, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to dot it onto my watercolor, and you can see it's kind of like dispersing the watercolor, and it leaves these kind of like weird bubble type things where you can see the paper underneath. So it looks like that. Okay. All right, the next one is using plastic wrap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a wash of color. So I'm going to put my color down first, get a nice big wash on there. Right. And this will only work while it's wet again, so if your watercolor is dry, this technique will not work. And then this is another one of those techniques where you're not going to see the results until it's dry. But when it does dry, it leaves a really cool kind of texture. It looks all crinkly and interesting. So I'm going to put these colors down first. I'm going to kind of blend them together a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some plastic wrap. I'm going to crumple it up kind of a little bit just to give it that interesting texture. And then I'm just going to stick it onto the watercolor. I'm going to press it down. And then I'm going to let it dry there. Okay, so I'm not going to pick it back up yet. You can already see the kind of pattern happening underneath. But I'm just going to let it dry there. Okay, and then when I pick it up, it's going to look almost like little icicles and like little interesting triangle kind of funky shapes. So I'm going to leave that there to dry. And then I'll see what it looks like when it's dry. But while we're here, I'm going to go back to my glazing since this first layer is done. And again, like we said, glazing is just adding layers on top of layers. So I'm just going to grab a different color and just add another layer on top. And you can still kind of see the blue underneath. And so it starts to kind of create these really interesting color combinations where you're just kind of layering the colors on top of each other and they kind of show through. And you can do as many layers as you want to. Okay, so the next one is scratching before you paint. So I'm going to use this little stick, and I'm going to scratch my paper. I'm going to press down, make little scratches in my paper. And then when I go to paint over top of it, some of that watercolor should seep into those little cracks, and it's going to show up a little bit more, it's going to show up where the little scratches were. So you can see the little scratches are showing up, and they're kind of a little bit darker where the watercolor is kind of seeping into the little cracks. And so then I've got my little scratches in my watercolor. The next one you can do is scratching after you paint. So I'm going to put down a wash first. And then I can take that same little tool and just scratch into it. And it's going to leave kind of a different kind of mark where it's almost white where you're scratching it because you're scratching away the pigment. But I'm just scratching, and then I get left with two different kinds of scratch marks. So you'll see the one where you scratch after painting, the scratches are going to be white, and when you scratch before, it's going to be darker. Okay? The next one, moving forward, is a splatter. So this one you have to be careful with. You don't want to make a mess. You don't want to get it everywhere. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to take a little bit of pigment on your brush, and you're kind of just going to use your finger, hold it up a little bit, and just kind of go downwards and splat. Boop. And then it creates a sort of splatter effect. And I'm just kind of moving it over my finger, flicking the brush over my finger to create those kind of splatter effects. And you can use different colors to get different things. You can also use like little cut out pieces of paper. And so if I were to put like a cut out circle right here, then when I splatter over top of it, I can lift up the circle and it's going to leave like a little blank circle in the middle with the splatter around it. Okay? Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the sponge. So I'm going to put down a wash, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little sponge, and I'm just going to start stamping it. And you can do it that way where you kind of stamp up some pigment, or you can take your sponge, dampen it just a little bit, and then stick it in a little bit of pigment. It's the bell. But stick it in a little bit of pigment and then stamp it over top, and you'll get kind of this interesting texture. So using the stamp to show some texture. All right, and then the last one that you can do is called blotting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down a wash. So I've got a wash down first. Okay, so I've got my wash down first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paper towel, and I'm just going to blot it in some areas, and the harder you press, the more pigment it's going to pull up, and it's going to leave those kind of weird, funky, strange lines. So again, the more you press, the more pigment you pick up, the kind of weirder and stranger lines and textures you're going to get. And that is some more watercolor techniques. Perfect.